this coming Sunday is Soup and Sandwich Sunday. And so it's a short day, a nice day. We enjoy that. Bring some soup to share, some sandwiches. Dessert is in order. Yes, ma'am? All those who are in college and career, bring your sleds and your snow stuff. So plan on that in the afternoon after the service. So college and career activity after the services on Sunday. And soup and sandwich, early afternoon service, no evening service this Sunday. And then also don't forget that 1 week from tonight is the annual business meeting. And we sure do need the Lord's help. We need wisdom. So please be in prayer. The budget committee has finished their work. I think all that's happening now is all reports and things are getting collected. And so we want God's will. If we don't have God's will, we've got nothing. So please be in prayer for wisdom for 1 week from now. We'll have more prayer requests, but do pray for Scott, who's at Riverside Drive this weekend. And Nathan just got asked to speak at Cornerstone Baptist in Madison, Maine in the middle of February 10th. So be in prayer for that pulpit supply as well. Okay, let's ask the Lord's blessing on our time together. Father in heaven, thank you for the opportunity to be together tonight, to spend a few minutes in the Word, to be refreshed and encouraged by sharing our prayer requests and coming before your throne. We thank you that you're a God who hears and who cares. And now, Lord, bless this time. We thank you for it. In Jesus' name, amen. Open your Bibles, please, to the book of Proverbs. And in fact, let's go to Proverbs chapter 10 for just a moment. I want to show you something. I mentioned last week and the week before as we began this great study on the book of Proverbs that the first 9 chapters are really kind of introductory. But I want to show you in chapter 10 what this looks like. And you've read through this before, so this is not unfamiliar to you. Proverbs 10 and looking at verse 1. Proverbs 10, verse 1. It says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, a wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish son is a grief to his mother." Now, see, this is what we're used to. This is what we think of when we think of Proverbs. These assorted, miscellaneous, generally true statements, kind of pithy. Some of them are a little bit humorous. Some of them are pretty biting, some can be almost a little bit sarcastic, and so on. This is what we think of when we think of Proverbs, from chapter 10 running all the way pretty near to the end of the book. That's what we think of when we think of Proverbs. But go back to chapter 2 and notice the difference between what we just read and what we're looking at tonight in Proverbs chapter 2. We've already covered chapter 1, so we're in the second chapter, looking at verse 1. "My son, if you will receive my words and treasure my commandments within you, make your ear attentive to wisdom, incline your heart to understanding. For if you cry for discernment, lift your voice for understanding. If you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasure, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice, and he preserves the way of his godly ones," and so on. What do you see that's different between just the one verse we read in chapter 10 and these 8 verses that we just read here in chapter 2? Let me give you one big thing. This is a paragraph. This all flows together. It's all running the same theme, and it will actually continue to do that pretty much for the whole chapter. When you start reading in chapter 10, you'll read a verse, and you'll say, well, that's kind of a completed thought. The next verse is an entirely different subject. Now, occasionally, you'll get 2 or 3 or 4 verses that hang together and form a little mini paragraph. But most of the book of Proverbs are these little pithy statements, pretty short. In English, they're a verse. So they're 4, 5, 6 words in one line, 4, 5, 6, 7 words in the next line. In Hebrew, it's actually even tighter than that, because Hebrew can compress And so it might even be like 3 words in one line and 4 words in another. And that's what this looks like, is this kind of thing. So we're in the introductory period, the introductory material that is supposed to be getting us excited about, why would I want to find out more about wisdom? Why would I say this is really, really important to me and I've got to have wisdom? That's what Solomon is doing. And the whole front end, the whole first 9 chapters is a long, extended introduction trying to get us to say, you know, I really do want to find out about wisdom. I really do want to understand what it is to have wisdom from God. So we're still in that introductory period. And in the chapter that we're looking at together tonight, chapter 2, we're going to be seeing 4 things. The first part is going to be the great hunt for wisdom in the first 8 verses. I just read that for us. And the second, verses 9, 10, and 11, is the results of that search for wisdom. The third part, verses 12 through 19, is the description of the way of evil. And then lastly, verses 20 through 22, is the way of good men, the opposite of the way of evil. So I just read verses 1 through 8. Let me pick it up for us at verse 9. Verse 9. Then you will discern righteousness and justice and equity and every good course, for wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will guard you, understanding will watch over you, to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of uprightness, to walk in the ways of darkness, who delight in doing evil, and rejoice in the perversity of evil, whose paths are crooked, and who are devious in their ways, to deliver you from the strange woman, from the adulteress who flatters with her words, that leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, and her tracks lead to the dead. None who go to her return again, nor do they reach the paths of life. So you will walk in the way of good men, and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be uprooted from it. So let's look at these 4 component parts now. In the first 8 verses, the great hunt for wisdom. Notice, if you will, remember that Hebrew poetry is structured on parallelism. So you've got these parallel lines, parallel concepts. And just look at what is being sought for, what is being looked for in the first couple of verses. Chapter 2, verse 1, my son, if you'll receive my words, so words is what's being looked for, and treasure my commandments. So look now at the next several verses. In the first verse, words, commandments. Verse 2, wisdom, understanding. Verse 3, discernment, understanding. Verse 4, silver, hidden treasures. Verse 5, fear of the Lord and knowledge of God. So the way that Solomon is structuring this is he's talking about something that is extremely valuable to find. And what is it that's so valuable to find? Well, it's wisdom. It's discernment. How would you define or describe, say, the word discernment in verse 3? The English translation uses, for if you cry for discernment, lift your voice for understanding. How would you describe the word discernment?
To be able to decipher, to understand between 2 different things.
Okay. So seeing the difference between 2 different things. What else? How else would you describe discernment? Proper judgment, okay. Try this on for size. The ability to see beyond the superficial to something that's interior and maybe more real. So we've all met people who project a certain persona. They want you to like them. And so they're trying to figure out, what do you like? And they're trying to present themselves as a likable person. But as you get to know them and you talk to them a little bit, you can kind of see between the cracks, this person is really not the kind of person I want to be friends with. That's discernment. Or how about in verse 1, words and commandments. See the parallel? If you'll receive my words, treasure my commandments. Why would commandments be important to us? Why would we say, our culture says, don't tell me what to do. But why would we as Christians say, I want commandments. This is something that I want to find out about. Why would we say that? Yeah, because of our Creator, because God has told us the right way to live, and I want to be told, what am I supposed to do? How do I live? So we want that, we need that. So now we've looked at this parallel of what it is we're hunting for, but now flip it around and look at the parallel of the verbs in the front several verses. What is a verb again? An action word. So look at the action words in the first several verses. In verse 1, receive and treasure. Verse 2, ear attentive and incline your heart. Verse 3, cry, lift your voice. Verse 4, seek and search. Verse 5, discern and discover. Now, what sort of pictures come into your head with some of those words? Not all of them are real exciting, but some of them do have a certain level of excitement about them. So what comes into your head when you see those action words? Shari is smiling. All right, there you are, a treasure hunter. You're on the trail of something interesting, exciting, and when you think treasure hunter, what's a key word? Does he go looking for Chevys up on blocks and backyards? Treasure, it's valuable. You're searching for something that's valuable. It's worthwhile. And it's a hunt, it's a quest, it's a seeking, it's a searching. And this requires energy. This requires effort. This requires investigation. And so Solomon is saying, if you will have this kind of an attitude about you, if you will say, I'm on a treasure hunt, and when I have found my quarry, when I have found what I'm looking for, it is going to be extremely valuable to me. Just like, PBS has this show, Antiques Roadshow. I'm sure you've heard of it. And, Lori records some of that, and we watch it sometimes. We get in about 12 minutes before we fall asleep. But here's a rule of thumb. If somebody finds a painting, and it is the ugliest, most grotesque, weirdest painting you ever hope to see or you never want to see, it's going to be worth $100,000. If it's a beautiful scene, very nicely done, the appraiser will say, well, it's a nice decorative piece, and it's probably worth about $10. But some of these people find these things in dumpsters and in their grandmother's attics. And imagine going to look in an old house in an attic, and you find a trunk, and you're wondering what's in there, and you find, a piece of jewelry, say. And you're wondering, that's costume jewelry, that's just glass. That's brass and glass. But then you look at it and say, well, what if it's not? What if it's real? And there's an excitement. This could be very valuable. There ought to be an excitement about us. There ought to be a joy. There ought to be a quest that we would say, I want wisdom. I want discernment. I want to be able to see things. I want to be able to know things about life, about God, about people. I need that, I want that, and I'm on a hunt for it. And just like if you knew somewhere in your grandmother's attic there was a piece of jewelry or a vase that was worth $10,000, you would turn the place upside down to find it. You wouldn't stop. You wouldn't get halfway through the job and say, let's quit. I'm tired of all this dust. Let's go have toasted cheese sandwiches. You wouldn't do that. You would say, let's keep looking. That's the point here. It's a hunt. It's a quest. And so Solomon is saying, you need to make this a priority in your life, and you need to keep on looking. Now, notice what it is. He tips his hand and tells us what it is that we're going to find. We're on a hunt for wisdom. We're looking for understanding and discernment. And when we finally find the treasure, look in verse 5. Look at what it is that we find. Then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. So he kind of tips his hand. He lets us know. He gives us a clue ahead of time. You're looking for the ability to see people. You're looking for wisdom to know how do I arrange my life? How do I get organized? How do I handle things? And you're going to find it, but you're going to find it in a source. And that source is going to be God. The Lord is the source of wisdom. It says so in verse 6. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice, and he preserves the way of his godly ones. So we're going hunting for wisdom. I've got to understand things. I got to figure this out. I can't do it on my own. And when I finally have found what I'm looking for, it is actually the fear of the Lord, the knowledge of God. It's a relationship with God himself, because he is the source of all of this. And so he tells us in advance what it is that we're going to find when we find wisdom. Now, notice he's going to take this concept of the results of the search and expand on it a little bit in verses 9 through 11. The results of the search. Notice what he says in verse 9. Then you'll discern righteousness and justice and equity and every good course. For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will guard you. Understanding will watch over you. So what he says is, when you get to this point, when you have attained wisdom, you are going to find every good thing that you need. So in verse 9, you will discern righteousness and justice and equity and every good course. So we will be able to figure out what is the right thing to do. And let's face it, sometimes in our lives, we face situations and questions where trying to figure out the right thing to do is just really complicated. It's just really, really hard. There's so many interlocking pieces, so many relationships that impinge on it, and we're trying to figure out what is the right thing. Well, when you have wisdom, when you have the fear of the Lord, that comes to you. God will give you help to answer those questions, figure out those situations. He says in verse 10, wisdom will enter your heart. It's going to be a part of you. Knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. And you'll have discretion and understanding in verse 11. Now, notice that he actually is going to flip this around and say what it preserves us from. So starting in verse 12 and going through verse 19, he's going to give us a description of the way of evil. And wisdom is going to keep us from that. Wisdom is going to keep us from the way of evil. We can all of us, I think I used this illustration last week too, we can all of us think of people that we knew in our youth, kids that were our age, they went to grade school, high school with us. Somewhere along the line, they made some poor choices about relationships. They got involved with some other kids that were not good for them. and they ended up going down a different path. And I suspect that probably in this room, if we were to think about it and talk about it, we could probably come up with a list of names of people that we knew in our younger years who are now dead because they made wrong choices. And so notice what Solomon does starting in verse 12, this description of the way of evil. To deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who delight in doing evil and rejoice in the perversity of evil, whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. Verse 16, to deliver you from the strange woman, from the adulteress who flatters with her words, that leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God, for her house sinks down to death, and her tracks lead to the dead. None who go to her return again, nor do they reach the paths of life. So there's several things that he says about the way of evil here. In verse 12, the way of evil is parallel to the man who speaks perverse things. Perverse has the idea of corrupt or twisted or rebellious. The kind of kid I'm talking about in high school, they were the mavericks. They're the ones who couldn't seem to sit under authority. They always had to question and rebel against authority. That's this perversity that's going on here. Verse 13, from those who leave the paths of uprightness. So there's a right path, and these people decide they're going to get off of it. They walk in ways of darkness. Verse 14, who delight in doing evil and rejoice in the perversity of evil. They get a wicked pleasure out of doing wrong things. They actually like to do bad things. They rejoice in that. Verse 15, whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. What does devious mean? Sneaky, deceptive, liars. These are cheats. They're very sneaky, very tricky. These are tricky people. And so this is part of the description of the wrong path, of the path of evil. Probably the stereotype that I think is maybe getting a little bit better these days, but the stereotype of a devious person is a used car salesman. The guy who tries to sell you a pile of junk, and he knows it, but he's trying to get you to buy it because he's telling you, oh, this is great. Now I have to be a little careful because my father-in-law was for many, many years a used car salesman. He was the good kind. He did tell you what was going on with the vehicle. But that's the stereotype that goes with us, this deviousness. Now, in verse 16, Solomon is going to introduce another characteristic of the evil path, and this is a theme that runs through the whole book of Proverbs, and especially in the introduction, he has several longish passages that deal with immorality, with adultery and fornication. And here's what he has to say: to deliver you from the strange woman. Now, what's he talking about again? Well, he's talking about wisdom. Wisdom helps you to avoid this. Wisdom helps you to avoid the way of evil. And one component part of the way of evil is the woman who says, let's have fun together. But she is a strange woman, and she's an adulteress. She flatters with her words, and she, verse 17, she leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. Now just think about those two lines. The companion of her youth and the covenant. What covenant? Marriage. This is talking about the companion of her youth is her husband. And this is a woman who leaves him, walks away, and now she's coming to you and saying, oh, you're so handsome, you're so strong, and you're so emotionally stable and whatever. And Solomon is saying, wisdom tells you, get out of there. Don't talk to her. There's nothing good going to come of this. Wisdom says, this is the path of evil. And he, in other places, chapter 5 especially, is going to talk about this a lot. But you get a little hint of it here. Verse 18, for her house sinks down to death, and her tracks lead to the dead. What kind of a picture do you get in your mind? You know, you open her front door, and you step inside, and you discover that you're in an elevator shaft, and it goes to the grave. And if you want more detail on it, verse 19, none who go to her return again, nor do they reach the paths of life. This kind of a relationship destroys lives. This kind of sin ruins marriages. It ruins lives. It ruins potential for Christ. It destroys things. And Solomon is saying, wisdom is going to show you, hey, when you see big red flags waving back and forth over a woman's head, back up. Turn around and go the other way. Now, he's going to flip it again, and he's going to come back to, I'd like to tell you, Solomon says, once again, about the way of good men. So do you see how he's kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit here? So look in verse 20, 21, 22, the way of good men. So you will walk in the way of good men and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be uprooted from it. So he's saying, if you listen to me, if you search for wisdom, if you decide that you're on a treasure hunt, and the most valuable thing that you want to find is wisdom, discernment, the fear of the Lord. If you have that as your quest, then here's what's going to happen. You are going to find it. You will find the fear of the Lord and the source of wisdom. And you'll be able to stay away from the way of evil. You'll be able to stay away from the path that leads to destruction, from sin that would destroy you. You'll be able to see that. You'll be able to stay away from it. And he says, you will be able to go down the path of good men. You will be able to walk down the path that other good people have followed, and you're going to have blessing. Verse 21, notice there's a strong Jewish flavor to this. For the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. Remember the nomadic background of the Jewish people coming out of Egypt, wandering 40 years. They were herdsmen and shepherds and goat herders. They lived in tents. But God had said, I'm leading you to the promised land. I'm leading you to a land of milk and honey, and you're going to settle there. You're going to build houses. You're going to live in that land. And so for the Jewish people, to have a piece of property, to have a house, to have a place that belongs to you and your family is like the height of security and well-being. So Solomon is building on that picture, and he says, you're going to live in the land. If you attain wisdom, if you get wisdom, if you have the fear of the Lord, you're going to have blessing. And then one last flip in verse 22. Did you see it? But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be uprooted from it. So those who are wicked, they're going to get sent away. So another chapter that is intended to whet our appetite to be on the quest for wisdom, to be on a treasure hunt looking for insight and knowledge and discernment based on the fear of the Lord. Questions or comments? Take your prayer bulletins for